But maybe the Israeli nation and those who support the nation of Israel unconditionally understood there was going to be some blowback in the United States and preempted that with the authorship of this bill, which ultimately would take a catalyst to be approved. So what is the bill really? In my opinion, it's really the political weaponization of anti-Semitism.
This is the direction the world is going in at the present time. In our world, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. The sex instinct will be eradicated. We shall abolish the orgasm. There will be no loyalty except loyalty to the party. But always there will be the intoxication of power. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
When it comes to enforcing anti-discrimination laws, potentially, which could have an impact on the type of language, for instance, that is used in some of these.
Thanks for joining the Father Emmanuel Lemelson podcast, which reveals the darkest corners of government, corporate America, and culture with commentary from an Orthodox Christian perspective. Join our co-host, Theodora Lemelson, for another thought-provoking episode as we explore the progressive criminalization of Christianity.
The U.S. House of Representatives voted on May 1, 2024, on a bill ostensibly to tackle the problem of anti-Semitism, quote, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2023. This was in response to the widespread vandalism allegedly orchestrated by leftist agitators on American college campuses, protesting abuses of Palestinians in the Israeli military response to the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7, 2023. The bill, if made U.S. law, would make legally binding the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's IHRA's working definition of anti-Semitism with regard to, quote, the enforcement of federal anti-discrimination laws concerning education programs or activities and for other purposes, end quote. The IHRA is an intergovernmental organization consisting of 35 member countries, including Israel. Put another way, 34 foreign nations are involved in creating the text the bill relies on. If this bill is passed into law, it will be binding on U.S. citizens. According to the critics, the bill incorrectly equates criticism of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism, a stance that needs to be challenged. By way of background, the religious affiliation of the Israeli population as of 2022 was 73.6% Jewish, 18.1% Muslim, 1.9% Christian, and 1.6% Druze. If the bill becomes law, every incidence of speech deemed anti-Semitic, according to the IHRA, will be subject to enforcement of non-discrimination law. This bill passed the House with broad bipartisan support 320 to 91 and is now headed to the Senate. How should we think about this new piece of legislation?
So what's this bill all about? It's H.R. 6090, I believe. Ostensibly, it's a reaction, as has been widely reported in the media, to the pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses, which has been disruptive. It's dozens of colleges, I want to say 70 or 80 colleges, had some form of protest, disruptive protest. And of course, we saw many images in the media of anti-Semitic conduct, Jewish students being blocked from going to class, and so forth. But I think we need to take a step back from that and ask some more basic fundamental questions. Like, for example, when was this bill introduced exactly? Well, it was introduced on October 26th, about 6 months before these college campus protests broke out. And that, incidentally, was one day before Israel invaded Gaza in response to the Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th. So 19 days after those attacks. That's a pretty remarkable timeline. And why are timelines important? Well, in civil and criminal cases, they establish timelines because they want to eliminate suspects. And I think much has been said online by plenty of commentators about the problems with this bill. And we can go through all the sort of obscure and vague definitions that it seeks to prohibit under this definition of anti-Semitism, which really should never be codified. Even the authors of that document did not believe it should be codified. But the one that really jumps out, or should jump out at everyone, is the one on revising history as it relates to Christianity. And that one, as it's already been pointed out by plenty of commentators, stands to make the gospel illegal. And when we think about this, we have to say, were these college campus protests really engineered to make sure that the political will, the bipartisan political will, existed to push this bill through not only the House, but ultimately the Senate, and then be made into law? Because if that isn't the case, if it wasn't engineered, then the prescience for the author of the bill, 6 months before those protests took place, is just absolutely remarkable. But maybe the Israeli nation and those who support the nation of Israel unconditionally understood there was going to be some blowback in the United States and preempted that with the authorship of this bill, which ultimately would take a catalyst to be approved. So what is the bill really? In my opinion, it's really the political weaponization of anti-Semitism. And, in terms of anti-Semitism, of course, religious bigotry towards any religious group is not acceptable. Many of the commentators have really gone after the First Amendment issues contained in this bill, which is fair. First Amendment is extraordinarily important. Not sure it's intact in the United States anymore. Probably hasn't been for a long time. It's more theory. But if you look at some of the more prominent commentators, even amongst the evangelical Christians, it's interesting, because what you really see is you see this sort of First Amendment arguments and almost invariably this professed and unconditional support for the state of Israel. And that's interesting, because you don't really see people coming out, at least amongst the prominent evangelical voices, saying, well, any violation of the First Amendment is going to be problematic for our country and what we believe as a nation, but we have this reservation about maybe this thing that Israel did or that thing or something. You just almost don't hear that ever. At least I haven't in the commentary I've listened to. And that's really fascinating, because in terms of religious persecution, if you were to just watch the mainstream media or even some of these commentators who have really huge followings, you would probably have gotten the impression that the Jews are, excessively persecuted in the world, and there is persecution of Jews, there is discrimination, there's hatred towards them, as there is towards any religious group, frankly. But they are not the most persecuted religious group in the world by far. In fact, the most persecuted group religiously in the world, study after study shows, is actually Christians. So, for example, there's probably 200 million Christians who, it's been estimated by a number of studies, that are persecuted in one way or another in about 150 countries worldwide. And that number has grown substantially. There was a study put out by Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary that they estimated about 900,000 Christians were martyred between 2005 and 2015, so a period of 10 years. It's about 90,000 Christians a year. That means that a Christian was persecuted every 8 minutes. Those are absolutely shocking numbers. Nigeria, very few people talk about Nigeria. 65,000 Christians have been murdered in Nigeria in the last decade. These are numbers that really dwarf the persecution against other religious groups. And, for that not to be an issue politically in the United States is pretty remarkable. And in terms of how this sort of very pro-Israel stance, now I'm not taking a stance in this commentary on whether what Israel's doing is right or wrong at this moment, but it's really remarkable that the focus is on what's happening in the United States. There's this sort of dialogue about, should these students be running around dressed up as Palestinians? Obviously, I find it at a very minimum very strange. And obviously they should not, under any circumstance, be blocking Jewish students from going to class. But it's been exacerbated, I think. It's been a bit hyperbolized, because there hasn't been, as far as I know, any Jewish student that was actually harmed. I mean, they were blocked from going to class, which is objectively wrong. these protests were wrong the way they were carried out. They should never have been carried out this way. But during that time, in this period of time we're in now, you don't have to look back very far to see that in 2023, the Knesset had introduced a bill to outlaw evangelization in Israel. That would have made the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ illegal in Israel. And yet, nobody's talking about that. Now, the sort of highly politicized element of Christendom in the United States, the evangelicals, which have outsized political power and influence, are, of course, outraged at this bill for First Amendment reasons. And to the extent they show outrage that it might violate the First Amendment, inversely and proportionally, they universally show support for the State of Israel. But what's really interesting is that of the 10 major Christian groups that are sanctioned by the State of Israel, the evangelicals are not amongst them. So you've got, the Malkites, the Orthodox, the Catholics, the Syriacs, the Armenian Christians, but not actually the evangelicals, which is quite remarkable. And with the non-Jewish population of Israel being about 25%, we look at this sort of movement in the Knesset to outlaw the gospel, to outlaw evangelization, which, by the way, they use a very pejorative term. They use the term proselytization, as if it were the unwilling forcing of the Christian message, the Christian gospel onto people, which it's not. That's a completely and deliberately used word to mischaracterize the evangelization or the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It almost makes you wonder, what is the fear exactly? That Jews might be converted to Christianity? If that's the case, that looks awfully insecure about their own faith. And I think if you saw that same sort of bill being proposed in the United States, where you would say, we're going to outlaw, the reading of the Torah or something like that, or the proclamation that the Old Testament is part of the Bible, there would be outrage in America. And yet we don't really hear anything or very little in the United States about these bills being passed, or not passed, but proposed in Israel. I mean, thank God they weren't passed. But when we look at the reasons why they weren't passed, I came across commentary from this guy. I think his name was Joel Rosenberg. He worked for All Israeli News. He was the first one to break the story in Israel for the English-speaking community. And, he clearly lays out that Netanyahu did not allow these bills to proceed, not because I think he cared so much about religious freedom, as it were, or the Christian minority in Israel, but because of the problems it may have created with their political allies in the United States, the evangelicals, which you can't help but think sometimes look like the sort of politically active arm of Israel in the United States. And I get the impression, reading some of the quotes from Rosenberg and even from Netanyahu himself, that but for the political blowback in the United States, I'm not sure Netanyahu or any members of the Knesset would lose a single night of sleep if that bill became law, but for the blowback in the United States. But why it's being introduced, I think it's a sort of testing of the waters. And it sort of dovetails with these comments, I believe made, I want to say 2018 or 2019, by Netanyahu, that Israel is a state for the Jewish people and the Jewish people only. Well, that excludes a full quarter of the population, including Christians and Muslims, obviously, and Druze. So you have to look at really the sort of emerging theocracy of Israel, as it were, and this sort of, is there an intent to rewrite history? Before we even get to the problem of this bill, what's really the roots, and how much of our perception, the general public in America, how much of our perception is really driven by political propaganda, by a sort of newspeak. I mean, this is really becoming like truly, I hate to use it as a metaphor because it's often used, but it really is almost like the ministry of truth now under the Biden administration, where we're not only going to define terms, but we're going to even go ahead and seek to rewrite history. We don't get to do that. And when I talk about a theocracy emerging in Israel, it's not hard to see when you combine these comments about Israel being a country for its Jewish citizens, not for all of its citizens, but for its Jewish, that it is a Jewish state, that the gospel may very well become illegal to preach, although it didn't pass this time. We could see where maybe they're testing the waters, where the key element of a purported anti-Semitism bill in the United States is not really about anti-Semitism. It's really about anti-Christian. It's really about anti-history. And that's remarkable because you would think, reading this bill, that it is such a widespread problem in America that we need this bill that does what? It doesn't target even actually Islam, which is, I guess, where the problem is on the college campuses when you have these students sort of cosplaying to be Palestinians, although I'm sure many of them are probably not even really college students. It incredibly and subtly targets Christianity. And that's puts us right back into the first century, really, where proclaiming the gospel was, in fact, very problematic to the Jewish leadership. And we really have to take a close look at this. And Americans probably should move their gaze from these sort of loud college campus protests which are going on and take a look at what's actually going on in Israel and how religious freedom is being stifled there, and take a hard look at the actual statistics. You know, we look at, for example, these 80-plus churches that were recently burned down in Canada. Imagine if that was 80 synagogues. Imagine if that was 80 mosques. And why were they burned down? Why? They were targeted as revenge because of a story that purported to convey that these sort of Christian missionaries, I believe they were Catholic, had buried indigenous children. The Trudeau government spent $8 million to uncover these graves and to uncover the, quote, heartbreaking truth about these graves, and not a single body was found. And in the meantime, 80 churches were burned down. So if you don't think Christian persecution is a reality, you have to look at what's actually going on. And remarkably, as I speak to my Jewish friends, I have many Jewish friends who I love very much, they are completely unaware of these stories. They're completely unaware of these statistics. As we begin our dialogue and I ask them and I sort of poll them, they're very hyper-aware of anti-Semitic issues because it's in their face all the time. But when I bring up Nigeria, when I bring up the burning churches in Canada, when I bring up the churches being burnt in Europe, there's a complete unawareness. They say, really? I had no idea. And I bring up Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. I say, well, look, the great cathedral of Christendom, one of the great UNESCO World Heritage Sites, was turned into a mosque as part of sort of Erdogan's conquest, as he called it. And now we look at this other magnificent church of Monijora, which has 1,000-year-old, some of the best preserved 1,000-year-old Byzantine mosaics in the world, also just recently turned to a mosque. You go, where's the outcry? There is no outcry. So you look at all this coming together, and you look at sort of the theocracy, in my opinion, that Israel is turning into. And, you know, these other comments that Netanyahu made recently at the Holocaust memorial, that nobody came to the aid of Israel during World War II. Just an absolutely outlandish comment, because almost 17 million Americans served in World War II. And I believe something like 416 or 417,000, I want to say, died. And to liberate concentration camps, to exterminate the evil of Nazism. And then you would think that, well, geez, you know, the Holocaust, is terrible and as horrible as it is, it's such a stain on humanity. It's such a stain on our history as people. But it wasn't the only genocide. In fact, it wasn't even the largest genocide. We see that the Nazis killed 3.5 million Russian POWs, for example. There was 3 million Poles killed during the same time. You see that there was 1.5 million Romani and Armenians killed. You look at Bangladesh, 3 million people killed in genocide there, or Cambodia, another 3 million people killed. But you know which genocide was really the largest? And it actually coincided with the genocide of the Jews, was the genocide of the Christians under Stalin. 20 million Christians put to death. More than 105,000 clergy, priests and bishops put to death just between 1937 and 1941. Wrap your mind around that for a minute. That's 3 times the most aggressive estimates of the number of Jews killed in World War II under Hitler's Nazi Germany. And yet, people seem unaware of these numbers. And why is that important? Because it was the same sort of cultural Marxism, Marxist-Leninist undertones and undercurrents that we're seeing today. So in my mind, there's very little question that the ideological drivers of these college campuses and university protests are very much so sort of pro-Marxist, this almost extreme left liberal mentality, which is being exploited in a way maybe by those interested in promoting their own ideas about Palestine and the suffering of the people there. Fair enough. Being exploited by the Israeli government and its move to bar anti-Semitism at the expense of the First Amendment, at the expense of really Christianity. Actually, that's the real sacrificial lamb, not the First Amendment. And how much more important is the message of God and the person of Christ and the gospel? And that's really a remarkable dynamic. But the one that's least spoken of is actually the attack on Christianity. Again, the sort of movement towards the criminalization of Christianity, literally codifying it into law. And I know that that law also spoke about drawing comparisons between Nazi Germany and the Israeli government and its actions. But the Israeli government should, at a very minimum, try to be objectively careful in its image of what's going on, because, and without wanting to say more, any psychologist will tell you, Psychology 101, it will tell you that the abused all too often become the abuser. And that can be done out of a sense of empowerment. It can become done out of a sense of insecurity. It can be done out of a sense of wanting to get even. If Israel is made to look like they are becoming the abusers, the people who are bringing, and validly so, the carnage, the leveling of Gaza, the 100,000 casualties, 35,000 deaths, 65,000 wounded, and this huge, enormous wall wrapped around it. Why give the world those images? Think carefully about how that looks, while at the same time, in its own country, Israel seeks to ban the gospel. And you could see where people will say, well, let's take a look. How does that look in the eyes of history? And many commentators will come along and say, but they had to extinguish Hamas. They had to go after them aggressively. It's a densely populated area. They didn't really target innocent civilians. But if there's 100,000 casualties and Hamas only has 30,000 combatants, then in the very best scenario, the very best scenario for the Israelis, then 2/3, 66% of the casualties must be innocent non-combatants. That's a remarkable number. It's just absolutely huge. It's 2 innocent people killed. Even if you killed all of the Hamas combatants, which they've not obviously not been all killed, you would say that you had to kill 2 innocent people for every 1 combatant. Those are shocking numbers. And the images are shocking, but it's important to remember those images of Gaza being leveled, of innocent women and children hungry, of hospitals and universities bombed to the ground. They didn't exist when this bill was introduced. This was introduced 19 days after October 7th, after Hamas's abhorrent and evil and violent incursion into Israel, but 6 months before the college protests. So when you turn on the news and you're watching CNN or whatever news you're watching, you hear that this bill is in response to these college protests. I ask you, how's that possible? Just look at the timeline.
The IHRA's working definition has also come under heavy criticism for including several concerning examples of anti-Semitism. Of these, number 9 is particularly ominous. The text states, quote, using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, example, claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis, end quote. However, in Matthew 27, 24 through 25, we read the following, quote, so when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, or rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. And all the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children, end quote. In the antiphons of Great and Holy Thursday, we hear the words, today he who hung the earth upon the waters is hung upon the cross. He who is king of the angels is arrayed in a crown of thorns. He who wraps the heavens in clouds is wrapped in the purple of mockery. He who in the Jordan set Adam free receives blows upon his face. The bridegroom of the church is transfixed with nails. The son of the virgin is pierced with a spear. O my people, what have I done to you, and how have you repaid me? Instead of manna you have given me gall, instead of water, vinegar. Today the Jews nailed to the cross the Lord, who divided the sea with a rod and led them through the wilderness. Today they pierced with a lance the side of him who for their sake smote Egypt with plagues. They gave him gall to drink, who rained down manna on them for food. Do not be deceived, O Jews, for this is he who saved you in the sea and fed you in the wilderness. In light of these words, what is meant by, quote, classic anti-Semitism? And would preaching the gospel and celebrating the holy services of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church be deemed illegal if this bill becomes law? Let me be even more direct. Are the Jews the ones who killed Jesus?
In terms of whether or not the Jews killed Jesus, it's not even the right question. But if we must ask it, let us at least take the words of the Lord when he clearly says that no one takes it from me. I lay it down of my own accord. And I have authority to lay it down and to take it up again. I believe that was John 10:18. But at the same time, while the issue of asking the right question matters, we're not exactly permitted to rewrite history. So what could I possibly say that hasn't already been said before? We're talking about a religion with a 2,000-year history. We have the lives of the saints. We have the apostolic fathers. We have St. John Chrysostom and Justin Martyr on this question. But above all of that remains the key issue that Christianity stands apart from the other world religions in that it's not fixed on placing blame. It's not fixed on justice, reciprocal or otherwise. It's fixed on mercy and on love, and love as self-sacrifice. And the key component to love, of course, is freedom. This is why it's so incredibly important that Jesus says this, not only because he is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophets, which he certainly is, but importantly because if it wasn't a free act of his own will, and if it wasn't the will of the Father, then he actually wouldn't be the Messiah. But there is a risk, a very real risk, that if we begin to take away the historic elements, if we begin to take away the context, if we begin to find the messages in the gospel of Christ saying that the Jews killed Jesus, or in the hymns of the church, or amongst the great saints of our church, again, St. John Chrysostom or St. Augustine, then we begin to deconstruct the foundation upon which Jesus is the Messiah, the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophets, which is incredibly important. Now, the idea that Jesus was somehow angry at the Jews is absurd. In fact, they were all Jews, let's be honest. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, everyone around him was Jewish for the most part, with a few exceptions, the Samaritan woman, for example. So what does it mean to be a Jew? What about Simon of Cyrene? What about Joseph of Arimathea? What about Nicodemus? These were Jews around Jesus as well. And in the case of Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, of course, they take down the Lord's precious body. They anoint it with myrrh and oils, and really were sort of the proto-converts to Christianity before there even was a sense of Christianity. The early part of the synagogue, the early part of the temple that believed that Christ was the Messiah were actually called Nazarenes. And it was sometime later, about 60 or 70 years later, that they finally were fully expelled from the temple and became known as Christians. But this idea that, the Jews killed Jesus, I think sometimes it's more sensitive, actually, to Western thinkers and the Western mindset. We talked earlier about the evangelical Christians, for example, who found this bill that was introduced in Israel last year that would have prevented even conversations about Christianity from being legal, and it would have resulted in having even jail time attached, 1 to 2 years, depending on who the listeners were. If we look at within the Israeli mindset, within the Israeli mind, the Jewish mind, we can take examples from Moses Maimonides, for example, the great 12th century Sephardic Jewish philosopher and Talmudic scholar, widely revered during his lifetime, still revered in Israel today as a scholar and a philosopher. Weighs heavily in the Jewish tradition and Jewish thinking. He, for one, was unapologetic in saying that Christ simply imagined himself to be the Messiah and, frankly, deserved to die. So Maimonides is not found to be problematic in Israeli society and culture today, much less in their religion. And for Maimonides, of course, he even went as far as to say that he held Islam above Christianity. That is to say, he really found the anthropomorphic elements of sort of this fully God and fully human person of Christ to be extremely problematic. He believed the theology of the Holy Trinity to be polytheism and all of it to be blasphemy. So not unlike the first century. Here we go, fast forward 12 centuries to Spain in the 12th century, and we have the emergence of this revered Jewish thinker, still revered and highly influential In Israel today, you have rabbis in Israel espousing his teachings, supporting his thinking on that. So why is this issue so sensitive? And it's kind of remarkable because we could say, well, if Jesus really was not the Son of God, if he was not fully God and fully human, the third person in the Holy Trinity, the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophets and the fulfillment of the law, why does the Knesset even care? Why would this law be introduced that would bar even conversations, casual conversations about the person of Christ? Why would that be introduced? If he was just a man, if he was a blasphemer, if he had offended the Jewish state somehow, why would they care? That's an important question. Here we are 2,000 years later, and this person of Christ, this historical figure that there are secular Roman accounts of his life, of his activities, of his death. Why is he so problematic? He was not the only person crucified that day. In fact, he was crucified between two thieves. And the remarkable part about that is that while those two thieves had really sinned against the state, against the Roman authorities, it was really we who sinned against Christ. He took up sin himself. And yet, even in his death, in his crucifixion, the remarkable part is he continued to perform miracles. He allowed one of the thieves to enter into heaven, for example, which is as great a miracle as any. And look at how he was crucified. Even in his death, there was a placard placed above his crucifix, as there would have been for anyone crucified, saying that he was Jesus Christ, the King of the Jews. So even in death, he was the king. As we say in Greek, Jesu Christou Nika, Jesus Christ conquers. And I've heard some of these evangelical commentators recently talking about, well, it was really the Roman authorities who put Christ to death. I think there's this debate, was it the Romans, was it the Jews? Again, totally the wrong question if we are serious about our faith as Christians. But if we are to get into that question, the issue is often raised that, well, the Jews at the time could not put someone to death. They needed the Romans. But that is not totally accurate. The Jews could kill. For example, if a Gentile entered the temple, it was punishable by death. Paul was sent to prison for doing that. He thought he brought Gentiles into the temple. Look what happened to St. Steve, the proto-martyr and deacon. He was dragged outside and was understood to be a blasphemer and was mobbed and stoned to death by the Jews, quite frankly. And what about the woman caught in sin? She was about to be stoned to death. So the problem wasn't killing. The problem was legal versus illegal killing. Now, why would the Jews have wanted Jesus' death to be legal? Because, frankly, they didn't want responsibility for it. And in terms of the Romans, it's pretty clear from Pontius Pilate's comments that he, too, did not want responsibility. He saw no fault in Jesus. And, of course, we hear the chants of the Jewish mob saying, let his blood be on our hands and his blood be on the hands of our children. Those are pretty remarkable comments. This idea of deicide, frankly, that there's a blood bond here between the Jews and the person of Christ. But really, the context is a Jewish one. And I think that if we move into this thinking that we're going to blame Jews or we're going to get into the justice game, as it were, we're missing not only the point of Christ's life, the point of his death, but we're missing the fact that we believe him to be the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So extraordinarily delicate. It's really it's a razor's edge, and there is a temptation, I think, to move in this direction. And notwithstanding these absurd bills which are being proposed in Israel at the same time that nobody seems to be talking about again, and you look at those things, you say, well, in America, could you imagine if we were to propose a bill, even if we just proposed it, saying that it is illegal to say that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet? There would be outrage in the country, notwithstanding the fact that actually Christians are the most persecuted group. So but we see something similar happening in Israel. And again, sort of what we talked about earlier, this idea that the evangelical voices, which have this outsized power and influence in U.S. politics, maybe they're really the friends of Netanyahu in the Israeli parliament, because without the church fathers, without the hierarchy, without the sacraments, without the lives of the saints, without the priesthood, maybe that speech is most easily politicized. And maybe that's why, even though it's not actually one of the permitted religious groups in Israel, the Netanyahu government is so keen to keep that group, which almost, again, becomes like a political arm for Israel and the United States, pacified. So we get back to this and we look and say, well, did the Jews kill Jesus? Well, we can't say the Chinese killed Jesus. It's not, in fact, even our place. If you want to know what the fathers of the church said, go to the apostolic fathers, go to the church, the desert fathers, go to the lives of the saints, the great saints, John Chrysostom, Augustine, Justin Martyr, see what has been said. But that, of course, would only be ancillary to what Christ himself said, and with good reason, because Christianity will truly stand unique amongst the world's religions for a reason. It's the only religion where its founder claimed to be God, which for the Jews was an insult. It was blasphemy. It still is. As I said earlier, I don't think any member of the Knesset would have any problem with the bill passing, but for the pushback in the United States, which probably won't last that long. I suspect sooner or later they'll propose a bill like that again, and eventually it will pass. But for Orthodox Christians especially, this idea of the abundant love of God, this self-sacrificial love of God, sets Christianity apart. Buddha did not claim to be God. Moses did not make such a claim. Muhammad did not make such a claim. And the theology of the church is so extraordinarily beautiful and deep and rich that I don't see how a human mind could even conceive it. And we have to look at it as, again, this sort of paschal message that, yes, there was this historical context of the chosen people of God. They had the law and the prophets, and Christ says what? He doesn't diminish them at all, right? He didn't come to take away one iota of the law or the prophets. And by the way, the prophets were killed as well. Who were they killed by? So this idea that the head cornerstone, that the stone which the builder refused to become the head cornerstone, as it were, this idea of rejection of Christ cannot be allowed to turn into an accusation of deicide. It cannot be allowed for Christians to turn into a God of justice, because once that religious pride seeps in and it displaces the idea of self-sacrificial love, when justice trumps mercy, then it's really not Christianity actually at all. And I would say that when pride enters into any religious belief, the collective consciousness of the faithful, it harms it greatly. But we should only speak and criticize really our own faith, our own church, because how much more serious is our responsibility if the Jews reject Christ as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophets as the Messiah, and we accept him as that? How much more serious is our accountability? How much more serious will our standing be in a life to come before our Father, if we know this, if we've accepted this, and still act in a way that crucifies the risen Lord? In light of that, in light of the gravity of that, to speak of what the Jews did or did not do is folly. It's only a footnote to what Christ says himself, that he gave his life willingly. So this idea that love could exist, that God could be a God of love, that would give his only begotten Son for the expiation of our sins, for the remission of our sins, and at the same time to say that but the justice or the injustice or the fault or the blame would be to miss the point so incredibly profoundly. So getting back to the issue of his crucifixion, again, these placards, we see written above him on his cross that here is the King of the Jews. And it's written what? In 3 languages. It's in Latin, it's in Greek, it's in Hebrew. It's proclaiming that he is going to be, that he is God, that he is the King of all the world, over all the nations. And for we as Americans, if we are not very careful, if we continue to just focus almost with monovision or with tunnel vision on this sort of propagandized form of religion and law and politics, which neglects our own Christian heritage, we should not be concerned then when we lose our Christian identity completely, as is happening in Western Europe presently. The sort of Islamification of Europe should not be a concern or a bother to us, because we will have turned our back, as it were, entirely on our own faith. And if it is occurring in Europe, then it's only a matter of time before it occurs in America. If laws are being proposed in Israel which would outlaw even conversations about the person of Christ, as if the listener lacked the intelligence or the ability to discern or reason on their own whether that argument was persuasive, and it becomes a matter of religious censorship. And then we move into the United States where we're seeing this same thing, right? This bill, which it's really not that different. It's really the cousin, actually, of the Israeli bill, which didn't pass last year, but probably will pass at some point. Then we have essentially outlawed Christianity. We're going right back to the first century, right back to the same reasons that Stephen, the deacon Stephen, and proto-martyr, and the apostles were thrown in jail or were crucified or were martyred because they spoke about the good news of Christ. And if we're not extremely careful, if the party line simply becomes, we have to defend Israel at all costs because we cannot have any political clout if we don't, at what cost? And are they doing the same thing in Israel for us? And from what I can tell, there's these remarkable state of mind amongst some of the religious leadership and the political leadership in Israel. Again, I spoke a little bit earlier about this character, Rosenberg, and he actually had made the comment, it was quite audacious, that Christians all over the world should be incredibly grateful to Netanyahu that he didn't pass that bill last year. And he had also made other comments which really defied belief. Comments that Netanyahu found the evangelical component of U.S. politics to be so important that he took time out of his day. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken time out of his day to deal with this issue, meaning it wasn't about religious freedom or religious censorship. It was about maintaining political clout in the United States. Let's at least be aware of that. We should go into that with our eyes wide open, what's taking place, because you see Christianity is already basically barred or illegal in countries like Iran and other parts of the Middle East that are Islamic. But would the Jewish state do the same thing? It appears so. And so we look at these statistics currently, we see that 80% of incidents there was a study coming out of the UK, the Pew Research, and 80% of persecution, religious persecution around the world is directed towards Christians. And here we are in the United States, and every single commentator begins every commentary with, yes, the First Amendment is at risk, but we, without accountability, without reservation, support the state of Israel. That's remarkable. I mean, you would think if that was an honest statement that at least statistically a certain part of those commentators would have some criticism of Israel. And then you see, of course, Netanyahu and his government saying no one came to their aid. They'll fight with their fingernails if they have to. These are ridiculous statements. I mean, you've got Northrop Grumman F-15s and McDonnell Douglas F-16s. You've got Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning IIs in that country. They weren't built in Israel. So last time I checked, none of their adversaries fly those planes. You've got $300 billion in foreign aid, economic and military aid, over the last, 6 or 7 decades going to Israel, by far more than any other country in the world, and this is the response. So we have to be, again, go into this with our eyes wide open and understand that if we're willing to turn our back on our Christian heritage, if we're willing to watch the Trudeau regime in Canada blithely acknowledge the burning of 80 churches, and if we're willing to see sort of what's going on in the UK, I think there's 9 of the 23 mayors now in the UK are Islamic. I think there's Sharia courts already. I believe there's 3,000 mosques in the UK. I think they're planning another 3,000. You've got mosques now in Athens. You've got churches, the greatest churches of Christendom, being converted into mosques in Turkey. We should at least understand where that's headed. Every time a commentator opens their mouth and talks about this bill, but unequivocally supports the current political regime in Israel, they should at least understand the background. And if they agree with it, fine, but at least communicate fairly to the listeners so that you don't become like the mainstream media, what the political position of that party is. And it's very much so, at least in appearance, seems to be the problem. It seems like a theocracy, again, where you have thinkers like Maimonides who are unapologetic, saying Christ imagined he was the Messiah and was rightly or deserved to be put to death. That's an incredible statement. So let the Israelis and the Jews speak for themselves. Let the prophets speak for themselves. Look to the authoritative fathers of the church to speak on this issue. But for we as Christians, let us be unashamed as witnesses. Let us be intelligent and knowledgeable in our own faith, and let us proclaim it freely. And certainly, Let us stand up against these sort of bills, which really have nothing, in my view, to do with anti-Semitism. They're really just another attack on Christianity and another step towards the criminalization of Christianity.